Hey, Silent Pages fam. We're starting a new love journey. Tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. Now stay with us. The story begins. Eliza Worth stepped off the award stage with the applause still ringing behind her, a glittering ocean of sound that somehow made her feel even more alone. The trophy in her hand was warm from the stage lights, smooth, perfect, and strangely lifeless. It felt like holding a mannequin's hand, cold underneath the polish. Flash after flash exploded around her, swallowing her in manufactured stardust. She posed automatically, turning her head just so, softening her smile the way photographers liked. She had done this 1,000 times, but tonight her face felt like a mask that had been worn for too many hours. Behind it, a quiet dread pulsed in her chest, waiting for the moment she could finally breathe. Backstage, assistants descended on her the second she cleared the curtains. Someone tugged at the hem of her dress. Someone reapplied shimmer to her collarbones. Someone shoved a microphone near her mouth, asking about the honor of winning. Eliza responded with the kind of polished sincerity she could summon even half asleep. It's a privilege, truly. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, like it belonged to a character she was hired to play. She barely noticed when the crowd around her shifted. Her attention snapped only when her clutch buzzed quietly against her palm. A single vibration, the kind she had been anticipating and dreading for hours. Mark Rowan's review was out. Eliza stepped away from the cluster of stylists, retreating into a narrow corridor behind a curtain, pretending to need fresh air. Her heart thudded as she unlocked her phone. For a moment, she told herself she maybe shouldn't read it here. Not tonight. Not when she was wearing a dress she was supposed to feel proud in. Her thumb opened it anyway. The headline hit her first, bold and sharp enough to cut. The Plastic Mirage. Why Eliza Worth's performance leaves nothing but echoes. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to read on, even as each word dug deeper. Her acting is a complete triumph of design over truth. Technically flawless. Emotionally empty. A perfect reflection of what modern entertainment worships. Surface without soul. Surface without soul. That line echoed in her skull so loudly she barely heard the chatter around her. She had been called many things over the years. Beautiful, charming, versatile, bankable, but never soulless. Not directly. Not with such precision. Mark's words weren't a slap. They were a scalpel. Her jaw clenched as heat rose behind her eyes. Not tears, just the sting of humiliation wrapped around anger. Lena appeared suddenly at her side like a storm with high heels. There you are. They want you for the post-interview panel. Why are you hiding in a hallway? Eliza locked the screen quickly. I just needed a second. Lena narrowed her eyes. What happened? Eliza, she repeated, more firmly this time. Eliza exhaled through her nose. Rowan posted. Lena groaned dramatically. Oh God. Don't tell me you actually read it. I did. And Lena folded her arms. Is it his usual pretentious, overly poetic cruelty? It's worse. Lena's face hardened instantly. Her agent instincts kicked in. Then you're not reading the rest. I'm serious. Forget it. He thinks suffering equals art. If he could, he'd set fire to every streaming service and force everyone into a candlelit theater. Eliza almost laughed at that, but the lump in her throat didn't let her. She wished she could shrug it off, but the truth burned in her chest. Mark Rowan's opinion mattered to her more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was just because he was respected, because his reviews shaped careers, because he saw things others missed. But deep down, she knew it was because Mark wrote about art with a kind of intensity she longed to inspire in someone, anyone. The award in her hand suddenly felt small. Across the city, Mark Rowan sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of his laptop fading as the screen went dark. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted in the heavy, bone-deep way that came from caring too much about work he pretended didn't affect him anymore. His apartment was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made old memories creep in through the cracks. Memories of a younger version of himself rehearsing lines until dawn, chasing a dream he'd later abandon. He pushed the thoughts away. He stood, stretching, pacing toward his kitchen with the slow steps of someone carrying invisible weight. He put on water for tea, then leaned against the counter with a sigh. Had he been too harsh? He asked himself that every time he published a brutal review. And every time, the honest answer was the same. No. He said what he believed. What he saw? Tonight wasn't different. And yet, something in Eliza's performance had lodged beneath his ribs like a splinter. He hated superficial acting, and she embodied everything the modern industry rewarded. But during that one emotional monologue in the final episode, only a few seconds long, he saw a flicker, a tremor, something unpolished, real. But then it vanished, buried under the scripted perfection again. He couldn't write a review based on a spark she herself smothered. The kettle clicked off, dragging him from his thoughts. He poured the water, letting steam rise around his face. He told himself it didn't matter. Eliza Worth would never read his review, and even if she did, she wouldn't care. People like her lived in a different world. He didn't know that at this exact moment, she was staring at her reflection in the dark window of her car as it pulled away from the venue, replaying his words over and over. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, gripping the trophy like an anchor. Surface without soul. She hated him for saying it. She hated herself for fearing he was right. She hated that one man could make the entire night feel counterfeit. As the chauffeured car merged into traffic, a quiet thought settled in her mind, sharp and certain. If she ever crossed paths with Mark Rowan, she wouldn't let him hide behind his cold, perfect words. She didn't know yet that their paths were already set to collide. Collide so hard the impact would change both of them far more than any review ever could. The contract lay on Eliza's kitchen counter the next morning, thick and impossible to ignore. She stared at the pages as if they might rearrange themselves into something easier, something less terrifying. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her apartment, catching the gold lettering on the front page. The Glass Bell. A stage reimagining. A prestige project. A real one. The kind actors fought over. The kind that critics, even the merciless ones, respected. Her agent Lena paced behind her, heels tapping an impatient rhythm on the marble floor. Eliza, this is the opportunity we've been praying for. A serious piece. A visionary director. And a role that could show the world you're not just a screen-trained product. Eliza ignored the jab. Lena was only echoing the narrative the industry had already chosen for her. She lifted the contract, flipping through the pages again. Every detail was outlined. Rehearsal schedule, performance dates, press obligations. The intensity of the commitment almost made her dizzy. But none of that was the problem. She stopped at the page she'd been pretending not to see. The page with the director's stipulation. Mandatory coaching with Mark Rowan. For weeks. Daily sessions. Full creative authority granted to him. Her stomach sank like a stone. She hadn't slept all night because of him. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the cold precision of his words dissecting her craft. And now she was supposed to work with him, willingly, openly, under his direct scrutiny. He hates me, she muttered. Lena paused her pacing. He doesn't hate you. He hates glossy productions and studio-engineered acting. And maybe people who look too perfect on camera. And, okay, he might hate your last show. But he doesn't hate you personally. Eliza shot her a look. Fine, Lena conceded. He probably hates you a little personally. Eliza let out a breath that was halfway between a groan and a laugh. Why does Andreas want him specifically? Because Andreas Vallon, the director, was a genius with a flair for dramatic statements. Lena explained it like it was obvious. His vision for this production is raw truth. No artifice. No shortcuts. He believes Mark can strip you down to your core. Tear away every layer you hide behind. You want depth? This is how you get it. Eliza rubbed her hands together, trying to dispel the rising panic. She wanted depth. She wanted to change how the world saw her. But working with the man who'd publicly shredded her just hours ago, she pushed the contract away and exhaled shakily. He'll destroy me. Lena's voice softened. Or he'll rebuild you into something extraordinary. Sign it, Eliza. You're ready for this. After a long, heavy silence, Eliza picked up the pen. She signed her name at the bottom in a firm, steady stroke that didn't match the tremor she felt inside. Far across the city, Mark sat in a cramped office at the back of a rehearsal space, flipping through a binder Andreas had handed him that morning. He wasn't supposed to be here today. He came only because Andreas insisted on discussing a special assignment. When he reached the page naming the actress he'd be coaching, he froze. Eliza Worth. He felt the familiar pull of annoyance, of disbelief. And beneath that, something else he refused to examine. Is this a joke, he asked. Andreas leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. No, she's my lead. She just won an award for a role written in marketing bullet points. She also has potential, Andreas countered. You saw it. Don't pretend you didn't. Your review was harsh, but not blind. There was a spark in her performance. That spark lasted 2 seconds. And I want you to turn that spark into a fire. Mark shut the binder. She'll hate me. Good, Andreas said. Comfort kills transformation. Mark stood, pacing. You want me to break her. I want you to break what's false in her. And she wants that too, even if she hasn't admitted it yet. Mark stopped pacing. And if she refuses? Andreas smiled faintly. She already signed the contract. And she knows exactly what she agreed to. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the weight of responsibility. Coaching was something he did rarely and selectively. He chose students who wanted to be pushed to their limits. not celebrities shielded by publicists. Working with Eliza Worth felt like walking into a storm he didn't ask for. Later that afternoon, Eliza arrived at the rehearsal complex. The building smelled like old wood and cold air, a place with history etched into every wall. Theater energy. Real theater, not soundstage gloss. She found the assigned studio room, Studio 5, its door half open. Mark stood inside, back turned, stacking scripts on a table. He was wearing a simple black shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his posture rigid in that controlled, analytical way she recognized from photos. Seeing him in person was disorienting. He looked younger than she expected, but sharper, focused, a man who carried stillness like a blade. He sensed her presence and turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eliza's breath caught, part nerves, part resentment. Mark's expression didn't change. No surprise, no discomfort, just quiet assessment, as though she were a sculpture he was deciding whether to display or discard. He broke the silence first. "You're on time." She bristled at the neutrality in his voice, as if she were nothing more than another appointment on his calendar. "Should I not be?" He didn't answer that. He stepped closer, studying her, not with admiration or judgment, something more clinical, as if he were reading her in layers. "Our work starts today," he said. "If you want the role, you'll follow my process entirely. No shortcuts, no ego, no pretending. If that's going to be a problem, tell me now." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't sign the contract to be coddled." "I don't coddle," he said. "Ever." I noticed, she shot back. A flicker, barely visible, passed through his eyes. Not amusement. Recognition, maybe. "Good," he said quietly. "Then we understand each other." They didn't. Not even close. But the collision had begun, and neither of them could back out now. The next morning, the rehearsal hall felt colder than usual, though the old radiators rattled in a stubborn attempt to warm the space. Eliza arrived 5 minutes early, a quiet victory she hoped Mark would notice, if only to deprive him of the pleasure of making a comment. She placed her bag beside the stage wall, stretching her shoulders as she studied the empty room. Wooden floor scarred by decades of performances, tall windows covered in thin dust, a faint smell of paint and resin in the air. It should have felt inspiring. Instead, her stomach was tied in a slow, constricting knot. Mark walked in without greeting her. His stride was controlled, his expression composed with almost clinical precision. He set down a thick folder on the table and clicked a pen with a sharpness that made her flinch internally. "Warm-ups," he said. 10 minutes. She obeyed, though he didn't explain what kind or why. She began the breathing exercises she knew, deep diaphragm inhalations, controlled exhalations, neck looseners, tongue stretches. For a moment, she even forgot he was there. Then his voice cut through the space. "Stop." She froze mid-breath. "You're performing your warm-up," he said, stepping closer. "Not doing it. Start again. And this time, stop acting like someone who knows what she's doing." Her jaw clenched. "I do know what I'm doing." "Then prove it." Without the theatrics. Irritation burned under her skin, but she restarted the routine. He watched with the cold attentiveness of someone studying a malfunctioning mechanism. Every slight movement, every hesitation, every pattern in her breathing. He dissected it all. When she finished, he nodded once, as if acknowledging a basic requirement being met. "Good. Now we begin." He handed her a copy of Act 1. The margins were covered in his handwriting, precise notes, arrows, symbols, diagrams of emotional beats broken down into mathematical logic. She blinked at the page, taken aback. "You broke down every line?" she asked. "Lines, pauses, implied subtext, tone variables, movement, breath cycle. If you're going to play Helena in a serious production, we're not relying on charm or instincts. We're building a system." "A system," she echoed. "For a human emotion?" "For a performance," he corrected. "Your job is to create the illusion of emotion consistently, not occasionally stumble into something real." Her pulse jumped. "You really think I just stumble into things?" "Yes." The word hit like a slap. He gestured toward the center of the room. "Scene 32. Start when you're ready." She walked to her mark, script in hand, trying to swallow the anger rising through her throat. She had done countless auditions, scenes, shoots. She knew how to deliver. She began speaking the lines, pouring warmth, conflict, softness into her voice. The character's vulnerability came naturally to her. She could feel Helena's longing as if it were her own. But 2 sentences in, Mark raised a hand. "Stop." Her teeth pressed together. "What now?" "You're playing the emotion, not the truth." "Again." "I am playing the truth." "You're playing what you think truth looks like." Your voice rises on emotional words because you want them to sound emotional. It's decorative. Again. She tried again, grounding herself, simplifying, stripping away the flair. He interrupted after 3 lines. No, your breath is uneven. You anticipate the climax of the scene before you reach it. You rush compassion and you drag regret. Again, she repeated, again and again. Each attempt chipped at her confidence. He noted every flaw with a precision that felt inhuman. Her timing, her posture, her micro-reactions, the angle of her gaze, the tension in her jaw when she reached a painful sentence. Even the way she inhaled before a difficult word. After nearly an hour, she felt sweat sliding down her spine despite the cold. Her throat tightened. Her voice followed the line of fatigue. Finally, he stepped closer, studying her like a craftsman inspecting a cracked sculpture. You rely too much on instinct, he said. You've never examined how your technique works. You just fall into it. Intuition is fragile. When pressure rises, it breaks. Not for me, she whispered. It already is, he replied calmly. That's why you're struggling. His certainty left a bruise inside her chest. She hated how much it affected her. And she hated, even more, that a small part of her wondered if he was right. They ran the scene again, and again, and again, until her voice cracked, until she lost track of how many attempts had passed, until her emotions blended into exhaustion. She no longer felt Helena's longing. She barely felt her own. When she finally collapsed onto the floor, sitting with her back against the wall, Mark stood over her with the same steady gaze. You're not failing, he said, almost gently, but not gently enough. You're discovering the limits of your current method. That's good. You can't grow until something breaks. She dropped her eyes to the floor, throat tight. You make it sound like I'm some flawed machine. He exhaled, kneeling slightly so they were almost eye level. You're not a machine. You're an artist who's been running on automatic mode for too long. I'm turning the autopilot off. That's why this hurts. The words hit her unexpectedly. Not cruel, not gentle, simply true. But the truth didn't make it easier. For the first time since she'd met him, she didn't know what to say. He straightened, leaving a quiet space between them. Tomorrow, he said, gathering his notes. Same time. Be ready. When he left, the hall felt cavernous again, cold, echoing, too large for one person. Eliza lowered her head into her hands. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she was talented at all. The next week unfolded like a slow, grinding storm. Rehearsals stretched into hours, every scene pulled apart, examined, reshaped. Mark's voice became a constant presence in Eliza's mind, correcting, demanding, pushing harder than any instructor she'd ever worked with. His precision was merciless. His patience was selective, and his standards felt, at times, surgical and cold. But something shifted on the fourth day. It happened quietly, almost by accident. They had been working on the confrontation scene, Helena begging her sister for forgiveness. It was the emotional center of the first act, a place where Eliza usually shined. But Mark stopped her again and again and again, until her throat burned and her eyes glossed with frustration. Why can't you just tell me what you want? She finally snapped, dropping the script to the floor. You say not to perform emotion, not to imitate it, not to decorate it. Then what? What do you expect from me? Blood. He didn't react to her outburst. Not at first. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her with a stillness she had learned to read as him thinking deeply, more deeply than he let on. Eliza, he said slowly, why did you hesitate before the line I'm not enough? Every time. Exactly on that line. Why? Because the character is vulnerable, she shot back. No, he stepped closer. Because you are. Her breath caught. He didn't soften the observation. He simply waited. She looked away, heat rising in her chest. I'm not. You're terrified of failing. Everything about your delivery collapses when the line touches your fear. And you don't push through it. You retreat. You cover it with technique. His voice lowered, losing some of its usual sharpness. You don't trust yourself to be raw. Eliza's throat tightened, painfully. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the pressure behind her eyes. You think I don't know how to be raw? She whispered. I think you've been punished every time you tried. The words sank into her like a stone dropped into deep water. She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came. And that silence, the one she hated more than anything, filled the room. For once, Mark didn't use it to push further. He simply let it sit, let her sit with it. The rehearsal resumed, but something in her had cracked open. And the moment she allowed herself to touch that crack, really touch it, the entire scene changed. Her voice no longer sounded like polished sadness. It trembled with something real, something she didn't entirely control. When the line, I'm not enough, left her lips, she barely recognized the emotion in it. Neither did Mark. His eyes lifted, startled, almost human in their softness. The scene ended in silence. A different silence than before. Eliza swallowed. Is that what you wanted? No, he said quietly. That's what Helena wanted. She couldn't tell if that was a compliment or not. but it was the closest thing she'd ever gotten from him. And that was the moment she began seeing him differently. Not softer, just less bulletproof. Later that evening, after most of the production team had left the building, Eliza walked down the hallway to retrieve her jacket. She paused when she saw a light coming from the small practice studio at the end of the corridor. She recognized the silhouette instantly. Tall, tense, shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying invisible weight. Mark stood in front of the rehearsal mirror, staring at the empty room as though it were judging him. He lifted a script in his hand, then let it fall to the floor. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled. The kind of physical tension that came from fighting something internal, not external. She had never seen him like that. Before she could stop herself, she stepped closer. Mark. He spun around, eyes sharp for a moment, until he realized it was her. Then the sharpness vanished, replaced by something she couldn't read. You left your notebook, she said, holding out the item she'd found. It was only half true. She could have given it to him tomorrow. But something about his expression had pulled her in. He took it slowly. Thanks. Eliza glanced at the discarded script. You rehearse? Alone. His jaw worked once. Sometimes. What scene? None of your concern. His tone wasn't cruel, it was defensive. Reflexive. The kind of tone a person used when protecting a bruise. She noticed then how still he became the moment her eyes shifted toward the mirror. Almost as if he didn't want to see himself reflected. Or didn't want her to. You used to act, didn't you? She asked softly. He didn't answer. But the silence told her enough. She stepped into the room. He didn't push her out. He didn't move at all, as though movement might reveal something he desperately wanted hidden. What happened? She asked. His eyes flicked away. He picked up the fallen script with a kind of resigned gentleness, brushing dust from the corner. I realized I wasn't meant for the stage. That's not a real answer. It's the one I'm giving. She studied him, the man who had dissected her flaws with chilling precision. The man who demanded honesty from her every day. And she saw it. The smallest shift, a fracture in his carefully controlled demeanor. Fear. Not a failure. Of reliving something that had already broken him. You freeze, she said quietly. When you're the one being seen. Mark's breath hitched just barely. She didn't know what trauma lived behind that reaction, whether it was a ruined performance, a public collapse, a personal betrayal. But for the first time, she understood something fundamental. Mark wasn't cold. He was protecting a wound so deep he'd built an entire personality to guard it. And suddenly he wasn't just the critic, the analyst, the relentless perfectionist. He was a man who used logic as armor. A man who demanded control because he had lost it once and it nearly destroyed him. A man whose brilliance came from a place of pain, not superiority. He shifted, uncomfortable under her gaze. You shouldn't be here. You helped me break my wall today, she said. Maybe I'm just returning the favor. He stared at her for a long, unreadable moment. Then, for the first time since they had met, his voice softened in a way she didn't expect. Eliza, don't try to fix me. I'm not trying to fix you, she replied. I'm trying to understand you. And that, unexpectedly, was the moment he looked away, unable to hold her eyes any longer. Because understanding, to Mark Rowan, was far scarier than criticism. The romantic scene was scheduled for a late afternoon rehearsal, the kind of hour when the light outside the studio turned amber and the whole building felt quieter, more intimate. Eliza wasn't nervous. At least she told herself she wasn't. But her pulse had a different story to tell. She had run through the lines a dozen times, but the script wasn't what unsettled her. It was the memory of Mark last night, vulnerable, exposed, trying and failing to hide a wound she had barely brushed against. He entered the room without a word, carrying a tablet with notes and the same guarded expression he wore whenever he didn't want her to read him. His gaze swept over the set, over her, and then landed on the empty stage space marked with tape. We'll run scene 12, he said. No choreography today. I want to see what you do naturally. Naturally. The word hit her like a dare. He moved closer, stopping only a breath away. He didn't break eye contact. He didn't explain the plan. He simply stood there, observing her with that razor-sharp intensity that saw both the best and worst in her, often in the same moment. This scene is about surrender, he continued. Helena stops thinking and lets herself feel. If you try to impress me, I'll stop you. If you hide, I'll stop you. Just follow the truth of the moment. Understood. Eliza nodded, but her throat had gone dry. He gave the cue. And suddenly, they weren't Mark and Eliza anymore. They were Helena and Adrian, circling each other in the flicker of candlelight, two characters whose entire story converged in this single breath of intimacy. He told her to improvise, but he didn't step away. If anything, he stepped closer. Look at me, he murmured. She lifted her eyes. His hand rose, almost absently, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. It was supposed to be a character choice, a gesture Adrian would make. But the touch was too gentle, too real, and it sent a thin line of heat down her spine. "Eliza," he said quietly, then corrected himself. "Helena." His slip hit her somewhere deep. She took a slow breath and laid her palm against his chest, feeling the rise and fall of it. He tensed at her touch, but didn't pull away. And when she leaned in to speak her line, he didn't seem to hear the words, only the closeness of her voice. "Don't run from me," she whispered. For a split second, something raw and unguarded flashed in Mark's eyes. Not the director, not the critic. The man. The one who stood in a dark rehearsal room, fighting ghosts only he could see. And then the scene overtook them. He cupped her waist, pulling her closer than the script demanded. She felt his breath against her cheek. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thickening with a tension she couldn't separate from her own heartbeat. "Eliza," he breathed, but the name was a warning, not instruction. She didn't listen. Her fingers slid upward, tracing the line of his jaw, and he closed his eyes as if the touch undid him. When he opened them again, the distance between them was gone. His forehead brushed hers, soft, tentative, testing a boundary they were both pretending still existed. It broke first, not with words, but with a kiss. He drew her in suddenly, almost desperately, as though something inside him snapped free from its constraints. Their lips met with startling intensity, hungry, unrestrained, terrifyingly real. His hand slid to the back of her neck, anchoring her, hers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. There was nothing rehearsed about it, nothing professional, nothing safe. She felt the full weight of every unsaid word between them in that single, consuming moment. Mark kissed her like a man who had denied himself softness for far too long. And Eliza kissed him back like she'd been waiting for him to break. The world dissolved, the scene forgotten, the characters irrelevant. It was just them, breathless, flushed, lost in each other, until the need for air finally forced them apart. He stepped back sharply, too sharply. His hand dropped from her skin as if he'd been burned. His breathing was uneven, his eyes wide, the walls slamming back up so fast she could practically hear them locking into place. "That," he said, voice rough, "was inappropriate." Eliza stared at him, stunned. "Mark." "No," he lifted a hand, not in anger, but in sheer defensive panic. "That wasn't part of the exercise. It shouldn't have happened." She felt the sting like a physical blow. "We were in character." He met her eyes, and the truth flashed there. They weren't. Not for 1 second. "That can't happen again," he said, quieter now, but no less firm. "We keep the boundary, or the entire production falls apart." "This isn't about the production," she whispered. "That's exactly what it's about," he insisted, but his voice betrayed him, shaken, conflicted, afraid. He stepped farther away, putting distance between them like a survival instinct. "Eliza, you need to go home for today." She waited for him to look at her, to give her anything that resembled the man who had just kissed her like he couldn't breathe without her. But he kept his eyes down, jaw clenched, hands folded behind his back like a soldier refusing temptation. So she left the room with her heart pounding and her lips still tingling. Mark stayed behind, staring at the empty space where she had stood. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him truly shaken, not by her performance, but by himself. The next morning, the air in the studio felt colder than usual. The floorboards echoed too sharply, every sound carrying a tension that hadn't existed before the kiss. Eliza arrived early, hoping the quiet would steady her nerves, but nothing about her felt steady. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Mark's hands on her waist, the heat of his mouth, the way he'd pulled away as if the intimacy had threatened to break him. She told herself to focus on work, focus on technique, focus on the upcoming presentation for the sponsors, a test run of Helena's pivotal breakdown scene, the moment that would secure funding and finalize the production. But all she could think about was how exposed she had felt in his arms. Mark entered right on time, posture rigid, face composed into the same cold professionalism he used as armor. He barely acknowledged her with a nod. "We have 30 minutes before the sponsors arrive," he said. "We're running the breakdown scene. Full emotional range. No shortcuts today." She swallowed. "Mark, about yesterday." "That was a mistake," he cut in. "Let's stay focused." Her stomach twisted painfully at the blunt finality in his voice. He didn't look at her. He didn't even glance at her. He'd sealed himself away completely. Eliza exhaled slowly and stepped onto the taped mark on the floor. She raised the script, but the words blurred. The scene demanded something raw, her character confessing a childhood memory of abandonment. Mark had pushed her for days to anchor the monologue in something personal. "Use something real," he had insisted. "Something that hurts. Otherwise the scene will collapse." She had avoided the request every time. And after yesterday, she felt even more fragile. "We're starting," Mark said, folding his arms. "Whenever you're ready." Eliza lifted her chin, inhaled, and began. At first, everything felt fine. Controlled. Measured. She delivered the opening lines with all the technical precision she had perfected over the years. But the moment she reached the emotional core of the scene, the place where she was supposed to let the pain spill out, her mind slammed shut. A door locked from the inside. The memory he wanted her to use flickered at the edge of her consciousness, the one she never let anyone see, not even herself. No, not here. Not today. Not with him watching her, like she was one wrong breath away from shattering. She kept it buried, and the scene died. Her voice flattened, her gaze skittered away from the imaginary partner, and the monologue slipped into performance rather than truth. Every word felt hollow. Every gesture felt placed. The scene completed itself mechanically, like a machine grinding through programmed motions. When she finished, Mark didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was harsher than any critique he had ever delivered. The sponsors began filtering into the room. Producers, donors, investors, taking their seats with polite smiles. Mark approached Eliza, his voice low. "That wasn't it," he said. "You know that. I don't have to bleed on command," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to bleed. I'm asking you to stop hiding." She straightened, meeting his eyes for the first time that morning. "And what about you? When exactly do you stop hiding?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Before either of them could say more, the director signaled for the presentation to begin. The lights dimmed. Cameras were set. The room fell quiet. Mark stepped aside, folding his hands behind his back as if bracing himself for impact. Eliza stepped into the light. She tried. God, she tried. She delivered the lines clearly. She hit the emotional beats. She executed the choreography, but none of it reached beyond the words. There was no trembling honesty, no vulnerability, no rawness. Her voice didn't break. Her posture didn't shift. Her walls remained firmly in place. It wasn't a disaster. It was worse. It was forgettable. By the final line, the sponsors were politely applauding, but their faces revealed the truth. Some looked confused, some unimpressed. A few whispered among themselves. A dead, dull silence followed the applause. The director cleared his throat. "Thank you, Eliza. We'll regroup later." She stepped off stage, heart hammering, cheeks burning with humiliation she refused to show. As soon as she reached the wings, she heard Mark's voice behind her, quiet, strained. "What happened? You wanted honesty," she said, forcing a bitter smile. "There it is. I didn't have it today." "That's not true." "It is." He shook his head, searching her face with a mixture of frustration and something that looked painfully like regret. "Eliza, you're capable of brilliance. When you let yourself feel anything, you're unstoppable. But today you shut down. Completely." Her breath trembled. "Maybe you're asking for something I'm not ready to give." His throat bobbed. "And maybe I pushed you too hard." That stunned her. Mark Rowan never admitted fault. Not even in theory. But his eyes, soft, conflicted, told her he meant it. "I shouldn't have asked you to dig into something personal if I wasn't willing," he trailed off, searching for words he wasn't used to speaking. "If I wasn't willing to meet you halfway." Her pulse stuttered. He looked away, jaw clenched with the weight of something heavy. "My fear," he said quietly, "got in the way." Again, Eliza stared at him, realizing with a painful clarity that he wasn't talking about the scene anymore. He was talking about the kiss, about the closeness, about the way he'd recoiled from her, as if proximity itself might break him open. "And my fear ruined the scene," she whispered. They stood facing each other, two people barricaded behind their own defenses, watching the wreckage they had created without meaning to. Mark finally exhaled, long and unsteady. "This was my fault. I thought I could separate everything. I can't. And it cost you today." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "So where do we go from here?" He looked at her, truly looked at her, with the kind of vulnerability she'd only glimpsed once before. "We fix it," he said. "Together. But next time, I don't ask you for something I'm too afraid to give myself." For the first time, she heard it clearly. Not the critic, not the mentor, not the man who demanded perfection. She heard Mark, and she realized the real crisis wasn't the failed performance. It was the two of them, standing on the edge of something neither knew how to approach without breaking. The fallout from the failed sponsor presentation spread through the company like a cold draft. Meetings were suddenly held behind closed doors. Whispers floated along the hallways. Producers avoided eye contact when they passed Mark and Eliza, exchanging the kind of concerned glances that suggested budget cuts and contingency plans. By Friday morning, the director summoned them both to the rehearsal room, his expression worn. "The board is uncertain," he said carefully. "They expected more. A lot more. We have 1 week to prove this production is worth saving. If we can't show emotional authenticity by then, we lose half the funding." Eliza's stomach twisted. Mark stood rigid as stone. The director continued. That breakdown scene has to work. Without it, there is no show. He left them in silence. Eliza stared at the empty stage, anger simmering under her skin. Not at the director. Not even at herself. At Mark. Because ever since the kiss, ever since he'd withdrawn into that frigid professionalism, he had kept her in emotional limbo, pushing her to be vulnerable while barricading himself behind walls she couldn't penetrate, demanding truth while living in denial. And it was poisoning everything. She turned toward him. You know this is falling apart, right? Mark rubbed a hand over his jaw. I know. Then why do you keep acting like this is only my problem? He froze. Her voice tightened. You want me to perform with honesty? With emotional depth? You ask me to open myself up, to tear into memories I don't even want to think about, let alone put on a stage. And yet, every time we get close to anything real, you shut down. He exhaled sharply. Eliza. No, she said, stepping closer. You don't get to cut me off this time. Not when the entire production is on the line. Not when you're the one holding it back more than anyone. His eyes flashed. I'm holding it back. Yes, she fired. You want authenticity, but you refuse to be authentic with me. You want vulnerability, but you're terrified of your own. You tell me to trust you, but you won't trust me with anything real. Not even yourself. A muscle ticked in his jaw. This isn't about me. It is, she insisted. It's exactly about you. You're so convinced that feeling something is a weakness. You're smothering the entire process just to protect yourself. He looked away, shoulders tense. The room suddenly felt too small to contain the two of them. Why did you quit acting? She demanded. You never talk about it. Everyone says you were brilliant, that you were supposed to be the next big name. And then you disappeared overnight. What? His silence was loud. Mark, she said softer now, what are you so afraid of? He closed his eyes as if her question hit a raw nerve. When he opened them, something in his expression cracked. Barely, but enough for her to see the fracture. You want the truth? He asked quietly. She nodded. He took a slow breath, steadying himself as though preparing to rip open a wound that had been left untouched for years. I quit acting, he said, because the last time I opened up on stage, really opened up, I broke. Completely. Eliza's breath hitched. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing once before stopping in front of her again. It was a play. Intense. The kind that demands your entire soul. I gave it everything I had. I accessed memories I thought I'd buried. My father had just died, and the grief was still raw. But I used it. I weaponized it. The audience loved it. His throat tightened. They stood and applauded. And I felt nothing. Eliza's eyes softened. The emotion I had used wasn't acting. It was real, unchecked pain. And when the scene ended, it didn't let me go. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think, couldn't stop drowning in it. His voice grew strained, fighting old memories. I realized that if I kept performing like that, I'd lose myself completely. So I left. Critics called it a waste, said I was weak, dramatic. But they didn't know that it was the only way I could survive. Eliza took a slow step closer, but this time he didn't pull away. So when I push you, he said, voice low, it's not because I want you to suffer. It's because I know what it feels like to hold back, and I know what it costs when you don't. Her anger melted into something softer, deeper, understanding, empathy. Mark, she whispered, why didn't you tell me this sooner? His shoulders dropped, defenses falling inch by inch. Because I don't like remembering what it felt like. And because letting anyone see that part of me, he swallowed. It scares me. And yet you just did. He met her eyes then, with a rawness she had never seen in him. It wasn't polished. It wasn't controlled. It was real. Eliza, he said quietly, you're the first person I've trusted with it. In years. She stepped toward him until they stood only inches apart. You don't have to be perfect, she murmured. You just have to be human with me. He let out a shaky breath, one that sounded like the release of a weight he'd been carrying alone for too long. His defenses, built carefully over years, fell in one silent collapse. And for the first time since she'd met him, Mark didn't look like the cold critic or the guarded mentor. He looked like a man standing without armor. A man choosing to trust her. A man finally letting her see him. The morning light spilled across the rehearsal studio, soft and forgiving, as if the world itself had pressed pause to watch what was about to unfold. Eliza stepped onto the stage, heart steady for the first time in days, the old tension replaced by a quiet determination. Mark was already there, pacing slowly, scripts clutched in one hand. But he moved differently today, lighter, freer, as if the armor he usually wore had been carefully set aside. Ready? He asked, his voice steady but carrying a warmth that had been absent for weeks. I'm ready, she replied, meeting his gaze with a trust that felt new, fragile, and terrifying all at once. They began with small steps, rehearsing the lines with deliberate care. Mark followed her lead. But this time he didn't interrupt, didn't dissect every gesture, didn't treat her like a machine to be calibrated. Instead, he matched her rhythm, mirrored her breath, and let the tension between them flow naturally, letting the scene dictate their movements rather than strict methodology. "Eliza," he whispered as they approached the pivotal moment, "don't hold back. Trust yourself. Trust me." She inhaled, letting the words sink deep into her bones. She remembered all the lessons, all the corrections, all the times he had pushed her past fear. But this time, she wasn't performing. She was living. Helena's grief, longing, and vulnerability poured through her, not as technique, but as raw, trembling truth. Every gesture, every glance, every shiver of emotion was unfiltered. Mark stepped closer, eyes soft, but strong, and for the first time he became more than a critic. He became a partner. When her lines demanded silence, he met her gaze and held it. When her trembling hand reached toward him, his own rose to meet it without hesitation, grounding her. When she faltered, his presence steadied her, not by authority, but by trust. The scene intensified. Her voice broke and soared. Her tears fell freely, unhidden, unpolished, perfectly unrefined. Mark responded to every inflection, every tremor, every crack in her armor, feeding it back with his own honest emotion. His fear, the one he had carried for years, no longer dictated his actions. He let himself feel, and in doing so, he amplified her truth rather than suppressing it. At the climax of the scene, when Helena confesses her deepest fear of abandonment, Eliza's body shook with a vulnerability she had always kept locked away. Mark stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. Not a correction, not an instruction, but a steadying, supportive touch. His eyes glistened with something she had never seen before: awe, admiration, and the unmistakable weight of shared truth. When the final line fell into silence, there was no applause, no critique, no evaluation. Only the echo of their hearts in the quiet room. The moment was electric, charged with a reality that no script could manufacture. Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. I think I finally understand," he said, voice breaking slightly. "This is what it's about. Not teaching technique, not forcing perfection, not controlling. It's about connecting, guiding, being here with someone through truth, through emotion, through trust." Eliza lowered her script, feeling her knees weaken slightly. "You're not just my coach anymore," she whispered. "I'm here," he said, eyes holding hers fully, "because I want to be, because I choose to be, not as a critic, not as a director, as someone who believes in you, in us." And in that moment, everything shifted. The fear, the tension, the distance, they all melted. Eliza's chest rose and fell with the rhythm of trust, and Mark realized that his purpose had never been about perfection or accolades. It was about guidance, about nurturing talent through care and love, about creating a space where someone else's brilliance could shine fully because he dared to let himself be present. For the first time, he wasn't standing behind a wall of judgment or technique. He was standing beside her, equal and real, fully human. And together, they transformed the scene from a set of lines and cues into a living, breathing testament to vulnerability, connection, and the power of trust. When the rehearsal ended, neither moved immediately. They simply stayed there, facing each other, sharing the silence that had become their sanctuary. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, they both knew the performance would never be the same. Not because of skill, not because of accolades, because they had finally given themselves to it, completely, without fear. The evening of the premiere arrived with an energy that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the theater. Outside, the city lights flickered against the wet pavement, a soft reflection of the anticipation that buzzed inside. Eliza stood backstage, dressed in her costume, heart hammering in a rhythm that threatened to drown out every other sound. The velvet curtains loomed before her, heavy and immovable, a silent challenge she was ready to meet. Mark appeared beside her, hands folded behind his back, the familiar rigidity softened by something new. He wasn't cold. He wasn't distant. He was simply present, watching, steady, fully attentive. For the first time in months, Eliza felt the weight of his judgment replaced by a quiet, unwavering support. "You're ready," he said softly. Not a command, not a critique, just a simple statement of fact. "I am," she whispered, even though her fingers trembled slightly on the script. The theater lights dimmed, signaling the start of the performance. A hush fell over the audience as they settled into their seats, a collective anticipation hanging like fragile glass. Every heartbeat backstage echoed in her ears, every breath a reminder of how vulnerable she was about to be. The opening scene flowed effortlessly, Eliza slipping into Helena's skin with the precision of rehearsed lines, yet imbued now with a rawness that made every word tremble with life. Mark mirrored her perfectly, not controlling, not dissecting, but responding in real time, matching her breaths, her pauses, the subtle tremor in her hands. The scene felt alive, as though the stage itself was breathing with them. As the pivotal breakdown approached, Eliza's chest tightened. This was the moment she had feared, the line where Helena exposed the depth of her grief and fear of abandonment. She inhaled, grounding herself in the trust she now had in Mark. She let the memory she had buried for so long surface, just enough to fuel authenticity without destroying herself. Her voice cracked, her hands shook, her knees threatened to buckle, and yet she didn't falter, because Mark was there, steady, present, unwavering. His hand hovered near hers, not to correct, not to guide, but to anchor. His eyes never left hers, and in that gaze, she found courage. When Helena confessed her deepest vulnerability, the theater seemed to hold its breath. The audience was rapt, silent, absorbed in every nuance of expression, every tremor of emotion. The applause that had once been polite and measured now came as a wave, soft at first, then swelling to thunderous intensity. Gasps, whispered exclamations, tears glistening on cheeks. Eliza saw it all reflected in the faces before her, and her heart swelled with triumph and relief. Backstage, Mark exhaled, a tension leaving his shoulders for the first time in years. He opened his tablet and began typing immediately. The review he wrote wasn't just professional, it was personal. He wrote about her bravery, her authenticity, the way she had transformed the scene, the production, and, quietly, him. He admitted his own fears, his past cynicism, and how witnessing her vulnerability had reignited something he thought lost forever. Eliza returned to the wings, still trembling from the intensity of the performance. Mark handed her a water bottle, his fingers brushing hers, casual yet intimate. She looked up at him, searching for a word, a gesture, anything that would capture the unspoken connection between them. "You were incredible," he said softly, voice low but sincere. "Not just as Helena, not just on that stage, but here," he added, tapping his chest gently, "with me, with everyone. You've changed everything." Eliza's lips curved into a tired, triumphant smile. "We did it," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. He had done as much as she had, matching her step for step, breath for breath. The cast joined them for bows, the audience rising to their feet, applause echoing through the theater like a wave that refused to break. Cameras flashed. Friends and family cheered from the front rows. Producers whispered excitedly, impressed and relieved. And through it all, Eliza and Mark shared a brief, meaningful glance, an acknowledgement of everything they had endured, every barrier they had torn down, every fear they had faced together. Later, in the quiet aftermath, Mark sent his review live, then leaned against the backstage wall, breathing deep, chest rising and falling with a sense of release he hadn't felt in years. His reputation was restored, but that mattered little now. What mattered was the truth he had found in guiding another human through fear, through vulnerability, through artistry. And as the final applause faded and the theater emptied, Eliza looked at him, seeing not just her mentor, not just her partner in performance, but the man who had finally allowed himself to feel fully again. "Thank you," she said, voice soft. He smiled, a small, genuine curve of lips that carried months of unspoken emotion. "No," he said. "Thank you. For trusting me. For trusting yourself. For reminding me why we do this at all." For a brief moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just them, the stage, and the unshakable truth of connection. In that shared silence, they both understood something profound. The art they had created wasn't just for the audience. It was for them, for each other, and for the rediscovery of what it meant to be alive, to feel, and to trust. The city was quiet that night, the streets washed in silver light from the nearly full moon. The theater buzz had long faded, replaced by the gentle hum of distant traffic and the occasional echo of footsteps. Eliza walked slowly along the riverside, letting the cool breeze brush against her face, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and the city's late-night calm. For the first time since the premiere, she felt fully herself, stripped of roles, performances, and expectations. A soft voice called her name from behind, familiar and steady. "Eliza." She turned, and there he was, Mark. No script, no notes, no professional distance. Just him, standing in the moonlight, eyes warm and open, the man she had fought with, learned from, and, in the last months, fallen for. "You're late," she teased lightly, though her heart skipped at the sight of him. "I wanted to see you." he said, stepping closer, the city quieting around them as if giving them space. Away from everything. Away from the stage, the applause, the noise. I needed to be honest. With you. With myself. Her breath caught. She could see it. The vulnerability he usually hid behind walls of intellect and control. The barrier he had spent years perfecting was gone, and he was exposed, real, trembling on the edge of courage. I've been thinking, he continued, taking a tentative step closer, about everything. About the rehearsals, the performances, the mistakes, the triumphs, about us. He swallowed, a brief pause that seemed to stretch across the city. I realized that in trying to protect myself, I almost lost what matters most. And that's you. Eliza's chest tightened. Her fingers curled around themselves as she searched his face for any hint of doubt, any sign this was still just a shadow of his old distance. There was none. Only clarity. Only honesty. I can't promise perfection, he said quietly, voice low, sincere. But I can promise this. I'll be present. I'll be real. And I want to be with you. Fully. Without reservation. Her lips trembled into a small, incredulous smile. You mean? I do, he said, reaching for her hand. Eliza, you've melted my cold, calculated walls. You've changed everything. And I don't want to imagine a future without you. Will you? He paused, searching her eyes, steadying himself. Will you be with me? Always. She laughed softly, a tear slipping down her cheek despite herself. You're dramatic, she said, though the smile couldn't be hidden. But yes, always. He smiled then, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made them glisten like sunlight on water. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the distance between them. Their foreheads met first, a tender brush, a pause before the inevitable. Then his lips found hers, soft at first, then firmer, claiming what had been building between them for months. The tension, the longing, the trust, and the unspoken love that neither had dared to name until now. The kiss deepened, a perfect symmetry of need and devotion, a seal on everything they had endured, everything they had revealed, everything they had conquered together. Around them, the city breathed, the river shimmered, and for that moment, nothing existed beyond the warmth, the truth, and the shared heartbeat between them. When they finally parted, Mark rested his forehead against hers, voice low and tender. You are my greatest masterpiece, he whispered, and I want to be by your side, always. Eliza laughed softly through tears, pressing her hand against his cheek. Then we're both finally exactly where we're supposed to be. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Yes, together, always. And under the moonlit sky, the world felt complete. The stage, the applause, the rehearsals, the fear, they were all behind them. Ahead was only the life they would build together, the trust they had earned, and the love that had grown between them, unshakable, undeniable, and beautifully real. For the first time in years, both of them felt whole. And in that quiet, sacred moment, they knew they were no longer just partners in art. They were partners in life. Thank you for listening to the story. Write your thoughts in the comments.